You can be successful in two ways. You can be successful by doing the right thing or doing things right.
I remember, honestly, like coming out of my room with a printed paper and waving it and being like, Kristen, you can't believe what happened. Like they found a way to turn all of the internet into training data. I couldn't shake from my head, from my soul, from my bones, honestly, what was going to happen.
Jack left, Prague took over, Elon made a bid to buy Twitter. The week before Elon actually bought Twitter, we just had the sense that something was going to happen. The deal was probably going to go through. And we were like, we've got to put out an app. So we just threw up a landing page and said, hey, we're going to build an app on the app protocol. It's called Bluesky, same name as the project. Check it out if you want. And we just got, hundreds of thousands of people signing up immediately.
I begged the OpenAI guys, like, please extend the NDA to include the exec team. So I remember getting up in front of them and be like, I know we have an agenda. I know we're supposed to talk about hitting these sales targets. We're just going to put that all away. And I want to show you guys something that's going to blow your minds.
This notion of smart contracts and all the things that you can do with them is very well understood. But back then, I think it was maybe a little bit less obvious.
Nobody thought it would work. I mean, this is the thing too. Like, I'm very happy to like hop in and be fully committed when
no one thinks it's going to work.
Nobody thinks it's going to work at all.
Every new wave, first the tools extend our workflow, then they change our workflow.
I like to think that the best technology is the tech that makes us more human and makes us more like humans and less like robots.
One idea is that your base layer is very simple. And the other is that your base layer might be more complex. I think this is where the Muneeb school of thought and the Vitalik school of thought like diverges, right?
I got a picture, a covertly taken picture from inside like a Chinese warehouse where they had built rack-mounted fake helium devices. And I didn't know whether to be like proud or disgusted, especially coming from gaming. If there's an angle to be had, it's going to be exploited.
I got access to GPT-3 as I was reporting that story. And so there was a night in like early October where I was like, well, I better try this thing out. And I sat down with it and spent 3 hours. And it was probably the most important transformative moment in my history with technology in my life.
I remember, honestly, like coming out of my room with a printed paper and waving it and being like, Kristen, you can't believe what happened. Like they found a way to turn all of the internet into training data. And she like patiently sat through as I enthusiastically told her what was happening. And I couldn't shake from my head, from my soul, from my bones, honestly, what was going to happen. Because if you played with GPT-2, it was horrible, right? It was a gimmick. It was novelty. I don't know if you remember, I scraped a decade of Fred Wilson, your partner's blog post, and I fine-tuned a version of GPT-2, and he was super dismissive. He's like, I don't think I'm out of a job anytime soon. And if you read the post that it generated, it was horrible. But if you appreciated what had happened to enable that and what that meant for a year from then, 2 years from then, 3 years from then, you knew it was going to get really, really wild and wonderful.
Gosh, it reminds me a lot of people who lost their minds when they read the Bitcoin white paper. And I don't know if you're one of those people. It doesn't matter. But I think I hear stories from people about, oh my, I read the Bitcoin white paper, and I just saw the future. It all unfolded, because if this is possible, then the next 20 years are possible.
There's a prof called Rich Sutton who has a post called The Bitter Lesson, and it basically lays out an argument in 2019, early 2019, that all of the traditional approaches to like finicky machine learning or AI techniques don't matter, and all you need is scale. You just need to scale up data and compute. And it was a beautiful articulation of what this set of breakthroughs, if you will, had just enabled, because you could now basically turn, well, you and I remember, right? Like we talked about how hard it was to get 30,000 pieces of labeled data that would, how do you scale? How could you possibly get 30,000 pieces of labeled data? Let's figure out how to do this. And all of a sudden they had an algorithm and a method to turn the corpus of the internet's text into training data, right? So you go from 30,000 examples to everything. And but you realize that GPT-2 and BERT were trained on a small sliver of what was now going to become possible. And we were at the first step of a 20-year run that was going to be like bountiful in a way that people couldn't appreciate.
Wow. It reminds me a little bit of, Yahoo and Lycos to Google, and the idea of PageRank and using the latent information in the internet. Maybe we come up with one of these breakthroughs every 20 years, who knows? But it's a wild thing. Mm-hmm. And to see that, so all of a sudden sort of in, 2019 or so, this becomes a building block. I'm curious to understand how you move from Airbnb into OpenAI. I'd love to talk about there was this massive unlock between having GPTs and having people get excited about them, which happened, while you were there.
So I had that 2-week stretch, and I realized that the world's going to change on a trajectory that I just wanted to go be a part of. And I think it's worth highlighting that I think the research world was quite open that the capabilities were going to improve dramatically. What excited me was what I was doing. Parallel and in lockstep with the capability improvement was a similar increase in accessibility. And I was able to do things, as I said, that Rohan and team required exceptional skill and expertise to do. And I'm like, I have no right doing this, and the world's going to go in this way. And what happens when profound technologies become dramatically more accessible to anybody, everybody, creative people, product builders? It's like the history it's amazing. I was going to go do exactly what I did with Coco. I was going to go start a company around this insight, and I was emailing researchers because I had known if you email researchers with real interest, they give you all the time in the world. I was going through old emails. I cold emailed Ilya from OpenAI, and I sent him the Bitter Lesson blog post. I'm like, I don't know if you've come across this, but here's why I really believe that this is going to happen. How naive in hindsight, right? And he goes, I'm very familiar with this. And we had an exchange, and I ended up meeting him and Greg for breakfast. In late 2019, I got a demo from them of an early version of what became GPT-3. And at that point, they had already realized that they wanted to commercialize and they wanted to bring it to market as an API. And there was just a great overlap in vision, right? My excitement was what happens when it becomes dramatically more accessible. They thought that the API was a great way to make it dramatically more accessible. I looked at GPT-3 and I'm like, there's no way I'm doing this. And I want to go be a part of that parade. And so I joined there in 2020.
Every new wave, first the tools extend our workflow, then they change our workflow. And so you see it in AI tools. First, the tools extend our workflow. So basically first AI dev tools were fancy autocomplete. And then you're seeing the new wave is completely changing the workflow. So Devin was the first time that I saw a tool that changed the workflow, where instead of an engineer doing every task, an engineer delegates every task. And you can imagine a future where every single engineer has 1,000 Devins reporting to them. But the problem is that it's not enough to do the work. Then there's iteration and incorporation, and there's a lot of feedback cycles. If you imagine being an engineer and having 1,000 junior engineers reporting to you, you're going to be spending a lot of time communicating with them. And so one thing that I think will change concretely is right now, for our product, every single jam is created by a human and sent to a human, trying to show hey, this needs to be fixed in this way. I think that in the future, a lot of jams are going to be created by engineers communicating to AIs, just trying to, in one shot, clearly show what needs to be changed. I think that's sort of where this will unfold. We're going to be spending a lot more time thinking about human to agent collaboration, human to agent, like bandwidth of communication.
I think the framing you laid out is exactly right. Sort of like step one has been AI as co-pilot, sort of like help me write this, help me write this code or help me write this text. And then step two is AI as agent.
Yes.
This idea is sitting right there, but somehow it's not yet fully unlocked, right? There are a lot of companies working on it. There are a lot of venture money going into this idea. There's sort of like a sense that it's there, but it's not activated yet. Do you have a sense of what it might take to activate it?
It used to be 15 years ago, if software wasn't that good at something, it was kind of okay. It was cool that it just existed. You would try to use it. You would sort of jump through hoops to use it. But in today's world where your whole life is running on software, our whole company runs on software. Our headquarters is a Slack channel. All the work that we do is software based. I don't have any printed papers. Things just have to work because every single person in our company is staking their professional reputation, their social capital in the company. Tools at work just have to work 100% of the time. And so the quality bar is quite high for you to actually adopt and use an agent. And so if you imagine there's best in class AI agent right now that gets it right 75% of the time, that actually is not yet good enough for you to use because you have to review its work every time. And so it's given you more cognitive overhead and it's actually given you more work to do. It'd be faster for you to do it itself. And so there's going to be an inflection point where it reaches 99% of the time it's good enough. And then suddenly the world will transform.
Basically, it's about trust, right? Copilot is, you add that trust step manually, and agent, / autonomous / or coworker, let's say, Copilot versus coworker, requires a whole lot more trust, and we're just not quite there. And I think you're right. It's a little bit about quality. It might be about some other things too that could unlock that quality. But it does seem like that is right on the doorstep. And one of the things that we talk about a lot at USV is what we were talking about a minute ago, which is the potential for sort of exponential progress as that happens, which is really hard to wrap your head around. If all this happens, all the sand, not only do we remove the sand in the gears, that's there today because it's annoying to plug things together and communication channels aren't wired up just right, but then we add every engineer has 1,000 engineers working for them. Every designer can make 1,000 iterations. Every piece of everything is times 1,000, and then that 1,000 is times 1,000, and it's times 1,000. I don't even know what to think about what that means for what things look like, and maybe even for how much change we're able to handle as a species, because I think there may be some sort of limiting factor there also.
I think you're right. I think the biggest rate limiter is how quickly we're willing and able to change our behaviors. And so it's good to have a rate limiter. Tradition is I think an important counterweight to what's technologically possible. One thing that I'm really excited about is, so if you look at what the internet did to media, the internet made distribution extremely cheap. And suddenly we had a Cambrian explosion of media outlets, where in the past it was just there were a handful, they were very centralized, they were major. And now it's everyone has a Substack. These Substacks are profitable to have because distribution cost is near zero. And so it's suddenly profitable to run your own media company. And that's been so cool. Now there's this there's a media company for every single niche. I'm really interested in product growth and so are, 2 million other people who read Lenny's Substack or whatever. I think that is about to happen with software. So up until this point, it's been too expensive to build niche software and to maintain niche software. But the cost of production is about to go to not zero, but it's about to decrease a lot. And so suddenly it will become profitable to build niche software. And so one of the things that I'm really excited about in progress, it's not all progress of the same thing at the same time, but it's all there's going to be progress in a lot of spaces and a lot of niches that don't get attention today.
You could imagine applications that sort of spawn in response to how you're using them, and in many different directions. We've made an investment recently in a company that is trying to explore this idea, and we haven't
announced it yet, so I won't say the name of it, but one of the ideas is sort of an adaptive UI. So we're used to sort of static UIs where we have an app with, a button in the same place. And that's because it's hard to build things and also it's hard to learn things. But you could also imagine not only software getting and apps getting developed at the speed of media, but also kind of UIs and the software interface itself changing and adapting contextually, for different purposes, for different people at different moments in time. Like essentially imagining just a really different kind of software experience than we're used to, a little bit akin to 5 years ago, or 20 years ago, everybody's reading the New York Times and watching ABC News. And now it's, this fragmented, media landscape that you're talking about. I could totally see that happening with software and software applications.
100%. I think that this is 20 years out, not 5 years out. But one of the things that is kind of bonkers to me is in today's world, it requires a full company to build any piece of software. Like Yelp exists because 400 people really need it, worked super hard to make it exist. In the future, you could imagine you ask, Siri V5, what restaurant should I go to? And it just, a UI is generated for you. And there has to be some sort of data lake where that information is pulled from. But the UI itself doesn't necessarily need a company to maintain. And that's very interesting. I'm really excited about that. It feels very futuristic.
Yeah, we're seeing it though. We're seeing versions of that already. I think today there are certain categories where it's very inexpensive to make an app. And I think the two areas where we're seeing it are on top of blockchain and crypto infrastructure and on top of AI infrastructure. And the way I've been thinking about both of those things is as we externalize more of the infrastructure, either through open source models or hosted models on the AI side, or through blockchains where you've got, transactions, sort of data, reconciliation of data, and the thing you just mentioned, which is some sort of data lake, right? So if you can have sort of compute like a brain, like AI, data like a data lake, and sort of addresses and payments and publicly verifiable computations all as external resources, then the surface area for building at least certain kinds of apps, I think, has the potential to be very, very thin. And I think the future you're painting is maybe 20 years away, but already today it feels like it felt in 2006, 2007, when it was oh wow, we have this whole internet JavaScript app stack, and a team of two can just go build an app. We're seeing that today in AI land and in crypto land, and I think that's going to keep happening.
We're what is blockchain but a shared database? And aren't those the pieces you need for an autonomous agent to be able to go out and piece together apps on the fly?
Right. And the piece that doesn't exist yet, but I think is really, really important, and one that we're looking for, is what is that data lake? That it may be the blockchain itself or something like it, or it may be something kind of adjacent. But if you can keep externalizing those pieces, then there's sort of a runtime, an application runtime that is shared, where the applications can be thinner on top of this bigger open stack. Which I think means that more people, more apps will get made more, faster. And that will either look like, polishing a stone to make the most polished, perfect app, or it will mean, millions of things that we can't even imagine, or both.
You can also see that this is already happening in small ways. So I was in Internet BuzzFeed 10 years ago, and already 10 years ago, they had a program that would try out lots of different headlines and images for each article, figure out what performed the best, and then keep that one. And of course, a human had to write all the different variations. But that's okay. But that's sort of, it rhymes with where we think the future is going. Or I remember seeing, while at Cloudflare, there was a company that built a Cloudflare app for the App Store that would optimize your ad placements on your website by just trying different things and then optimizing for some usage versus revenue formula. And see, we've been trying to do this for so long. It's so obvious that we'll keep trying, and the tools for it will get better and better.
As Helium started to succeed and started to become valuable, like people started to get very serious about cheating the system. How can I fake basically like whether these hotspots like are close to each other, where they say they are? Do they even exist? Like are they just purely in software? I remember one time, it's probably like in 2020, like I got a picture, a covertly taken picture from inside like a Chinese warehouse where they had built rack mounted fake Helium devices. And I didn't know whether to be like proud or disgusted, because like you're proud at some level that like you built a thing that is like so valuable that like someone goes to that level of effort to like cheat it. On the other hand, you're kind of disgusted, but you should also know better, especially coming from gaming. Like if there's any, and motorsports and like any competitive thing, like if there's an angle to be had, you know, it's going to be exploited and it's going to be taken advantage of. And I don't think that problem at some root level is actually solvable. Like I don't think can I prove that a real thing happened in the real world is actually a solvable problem in a reasonable way without closing off like the whole ecosystem of stuff, right? And by that I mean devices made by a manufacturer that are trusted, that you know, I think you could perhaps do it that way, but I think it inhibits the scale and kind of defeats the purpose at some level. So it's a really hard problem. Don't think it's solvable. It like fund it like deeply, but at the same time, it was only ever supposed to be a bootstrapping mechanism to get the network to a place where it could pass data around, right?
And nodes could get paid for transfer of data,
That's right.
not just coverage. But it's interesting that the trade-off between getting everything right up front and adapting as you go is always a really interesting trade-off, because there were other projects that were trying to do similar decentralized wireless networks around the time that Helium was starting. My sense has always been that Helium focused more on getting to market faster and then working out the problems along the way, because the opposite is to never launch or never get anywhere, because the problems like you're describing are just very, very hard to solve. So there's a try to sort of like a path one, that path is like theoretically solving them all in advance, but having that get in the way of ever starting, versus getting something out there that it may not be complete or perfect and then learning and adjusting, which then leads you to like governance and changing and all these things that have had to happen along the way. But I've always felt like that approach was probably fundamental to the network succeeding, really, and even having a chance of succeeding.
I certainly think so. I mean, it's my nature in general to be okay with trying things and failing quickly and trying something else. And I think that can be jarring, you know, for like employees, for community. It has a downside for sure, which is that nothing feels permanent, right? I like that because I think there's always a better way of doing the thing, but I also understand the need for some level of like sanity at the bottom. But I do think, you know, there's a startup saying that like perfect is the enemy of good, and I think that like it's pretty accurate, right? Like if you strive for, you know, to get everything exactly right, like odds are not only will you probably run out of money and die, but you probably weren't even focused on like the most important thing. We spent thousands of hours like debating, you know, stuff that after we launched, we're like, if I were to like rank them in a chart of importance, they wouldn't even have been on the like top 10,000 issues list, right? But when you're in your own universe, you're like, well, what about this and what about this and what about this? Whereas a real user is like, well, I pressed the button and nothing happened, and it took too long, right? And like, so instead of focusing on like that thing that's actually like user experience facing, you know, and really important, like you're worried about some esoteric, you know, protocol thing, which is a problem. It's just like a problem way down the line, or like not something that actually matters right now. A really important distinction, I think, especially for startups, is the difference between important and urgent. And like everything is important, right? But like only a few things are like genuinely urgent. And figuring out what those are, being able to like compartmentalize those things, I think is critically important. And as you said, there was a lot of startups around that I think were full of very smart people, but like just got tripped up in their own way of like trying to like perfect these systems that were always going to be imperfect, you know, at some level. And we ended up getting to market quickly. And I think we did a really good job making focusing on user experience and like making the product easy to use and easy to set up in like a consumer way. And it turns out that like that was actually the hard problem to solve, not the like, not the other stuff.
You can be successful in two ways. You can be successful by doing the right thing or doing things right. And that's always been a guiding light for me, because you run into entrepreneurs who, iterate and iterate and iterate, but they execute well. And so that buys them the time to do things right. And ultimately they find a fit. And then you run into other entrepreneurs that are just riding this rocket ship because they happen to, stumble on the right thing very early on. And, I think Twitter would be an example of doing everything wrong, but doing the right thing.
Right. But Multek's an example of the opposite. Isaac was quite capable of doing things right, like building software, shipping software, getting customers, but he wasn't doing the right thing. And I felt, in hindsight, looking back, I had a lot of energy, but was mostly focused on doing things right, but not necessarily doing the right thing. And when Brad showed up and poked holes in it, I noticed very clearly like there was another way of thinking about what the company was doing that I hadn't really been feeling. It was pretty influential for me.
And so there was a moment where you each realized, okay, that other guy is interesting, and maybe it's helping me see the world a little differently, or maybe represent something I think is interesting or is complementary. And then a fair amount of time passes.
I'd say maybe like 5 years, maybe a little less, but could have been 3 or 4.
Well, an entire boom and bust.
Right. The internet boomed and then bust. The firm that I was at the time, called Flatiron Partners, effectively went out of business when the internet blew up in 2001. And Brad and his partners had the rug pulled out from under them by the new CEO of AT&T, who decided that he didn't like AT&T having a venture firm that he didn't control. Do I have that right?
Yep.
And so we were both out of a job for totally different reasons. And I was trying to figure out what to do next. I really wanted to stay in venture. And Brad had seed funded a company called Dakota, led by a guy named Dave Morgan, who's well known to everybody at USV because we've backed him several times now. And Brad invited me to angel invest in Dakota. And I did. And angel investing was part of my way of kind of figuring out what to do next. I joined the board of Dakota, and it was Brad and me and Dave. And Dave's great and brings a lot of energy, but it just felt like, hey, we're good at this. We can work with a founder like Dave, and you can bring the thing you do, and I can bring the thing I do, and we get the right founder, and it could be magic. That's really, I think, Dakota in my mind was really the thing that seeded USV, because that to me was like, oh yeah, we can be good together.
There's another piece that you're skipping over that made a huge impression on me, and that is the way in which you worked out from under Flatiron.
Yeah.
Because when we came back together at Dakota, you were still essentially triaging a very large portfolio that had been a very big part of the boom and then the bust. I had been a little bit more fortunate in a way to sort of actually it was AT&T that decided to bring venture investing back in-house at the height of the bubble and sort of took us out of the market before the bust. And so I sort of stepped aside. Fred had to, go all the way through that. But the way he stuck with portfolio companies, worked out the problems, triage, saved the best, and then managed them, I got to see all of that. Because we were on the board together at Dakota while he was doing that. And so that made a huge impression on me.
You each came from venture with different flavors, and maybe there were things about it that didn't feel the best. And I know that when you started USV, you had an idea of what kind of firm you wanted it to be, and you designed it in a very intentional way.
Going back to the two ways to do things right or do the right thing. My skills in venture were a lot about doing venture right. And so Brad talks about like working out the portfolio, triaging the portfolio, staying with the companies, being there for the founders, like sticking it out for the long haul. that's very much about like how to do the venture business right.
Yep.
And I feel very strongly about that. And I had that even then in my DNA. What Brad really taught me was how to do the right thing, which is what to invest in. Like I was just like, we're just going to invest. Like I said to Brad, we're just going to invest in the internet. Like, like that'd be great. He's like, yeah, but Fred, like there's a lot of the internet. Like where are we going to invest? So I think when you think about USV, I think it's two people who both had a lot to bring, and we both brought it. And USV, I think, does both of those things. I think we do venture right, and we also do the right venture.
Like to think so.
I think the big moment for us is we got an early access to GPT-4. And the story behind that is we were actually pretty close with the kind of researchers at OpenAI. It's funny because we had this hunch around the application of this technology. We're really excited about it, right? And we were kind of doing everything we could in that area. And my guys would give pretty substantial presentations at the major conferences, and we were I think we were not like a super known quantity as a startup because we were still pretty small, even almost a decade in. But we were still, I think, respected to some degree because like we were the guys and gals applying law or this kind of technology to law. So we were like, that was like our niche.
Got it. So for the folks who are in the research community, they're looking around thinking about, all right, who's applying this to medicine? Who's applying this to learning? Who's applying this to law? And you guys were kind of visible there as
And we also made this kind of luck too. Like a former VP of engineering who's the part of the company and a number of jobs just joined OpenAI also right around where they're like working on GPT-4. So we were like already working on with OpenAI for at least a year or two, probably 2 years, 3 years at the time, 3 years at the time, because we were in these kind of early research programs with them for GPT-3, and we tried to partner with them around that, and like, there was this like, relationship that we had with them for well over a year, where they would bring to us certain models, and my team would just be like, these are totally worthless for law. Like, this is terrible. And honestly, I think we gained some credibility with their researchers just being super real about it. We were not like hype guys, kind of the opposite. Okay. So all these things are kind of coming together, so that sometime in like mid 2022, they said, hey, we just finished training this model. You said everything else you've done is bad, but we think you'll like this one. And they made it seem like it's another version of GPT-3. I started using it, and it was immediately obvious it wasn't. It was like, this is something very, very different. And first of all, to try to get yourself in this mindset, we were using this thing, playing with this thing. I remember the original demo, like seeing it interact and work before ChatGPT had come out. Right. So we were interacting with GPT-4 before ChatGPT. And for a lot of people, if you remember your ChatGPT moment of like, holy F, a computer can do this? Like, this is actually really smart. This is going to change everything. So we're seeing this under this like insane NDA. There's like only me and my co-founder can even talk about it, right? Nobody in my company can know about it for like a period of time. And we're using this like insane technology. And they originally made it available to us, not via API, but just like a Slack bot that I can like chat with. And it's actually even crazier. It's a Slack bot in a shared channel with their researchers. So they saw everything you're trying.
Right.
And the way it worked is you be like at OpenAI and then like talk to it, and then it would respond and then whatever, right? And so we started using this thing, and we were just completely blown away. And there are a lot of these like tests that we developed over the years of like, we'll know if it's real AI or not if X, Y, or Z. And it nailed every single one of them. I mean, that's the funny thing about this moment, even like a couple of years out, is like we had to reinvent our evaluations because we were apparently setting the bar too low. This may sound like so silly, but it's like almost our Turing test. There's this one now since passed Supreme Court Justice Scalia. He's kind of conservative, very conservative, but also very like funny writer. He uses a lot of sarcasm. And we're like, we'll know if we're seeing AI if we can tell when Justice Scalia is being sarcastic. And we had all these like examples, like maybe a dozen examples, and ran them through, and it nailed every single one of them. And the explanations were also like again, this is kind of old news for anybody who's used ChatGPT at this point. But we're seeing this model be, having never seen an AI do anything other than like sentiment analysis or like, make search better or whatever. All of a sudden it's like, well, I don't think Justice Scalia really thinks that golf is the most pressing issue facing America today. And so, I therefore think he's being sarcastic when he says that, about the Supreme Court case that he's evaluating. Really just absolutely, absolutely blown away. And so that began, we saw use cases for it kind of overnight. And really, honestly, the unlock for us, and I think for many other companies, was that it got answers right about the same rate as humans do.
Got it.
And that's obviously like mind blowing, right? Like all of a sudden you have this technology that get answers right about the same rate that the humans do.
And interesting timing wise is you were seeing GPT-4 before the rest of the world was seeing GPT-3, which is also kind of mind blowing. So having seen that, it caused you to make some pretty big changes in the product, like right away, right? So what was that like?
Within 2 weeks of seeing the product, we were announcing to the whole company that everybody's going to stop work on what they're doing right now, and they're going to be working on a new product based around this technology. And so we had maybe 100 people at the time. And I mean, obviously sales and marketing had to continue to sell and market the product we had at the time, but everybody else, we were asking to switch over to work on the new product. So first, just my co-founder and I had access. And then maybe like 5 days after we had access, we were going to have an executive offsite. And I begged the OpenAI guys, like, please extend the NDA to include the exec team, so we can at least talk about it at that level.
Yep.
And they finally did, like exactly like the minutes before the exec team offsite started. So I remember getting up in front of them, you're like, I know we have an agenda. I know we're supposed to talk about hitting these sales targets and these, we're just going to put that all away. And I want to show you guys something that's going to blow your minds. And so that exec team offsite ended up being just about getting almost alignment at the executive level, about kind of going in this direction. And then, and we were able to do that. There were definitely some skeptics, but I think more folks than not, I think could feel the seriousness of the moment, how ridiculous this technology was, and the kind of, what we were able to do, I think, between the moment we got access via Slack to the exec offsite is I just stayed up all night for a few nights and I put together my own kind of demo applications.
Yeah.
And sometimes, if a picture's 1,000 words, then like a demo is like 100,000 words or something like that. Like, it's like, you have something interactive, something that works, something that you can immediately see the value out of. I think to your point earlier about superpowers, I think a small superpower of mine,
right,
and sometimes a major distraction, again, it's pluses and minuses, is I'm able to put together something, using just basic JavaScript and HTML and some API calls or whatever that really works. It's not production ready, but it's something that you can get a conversation around, and it can really help move the company forward at the right moments.
I know a bunch of founders who also write code, and it's always a dangerous line a little bit of how much time you're going to spend doing that. But I do think I've seen it on multiple occasions, these key moments of like, there's something big here and I just need to freaking show you. So I'm just going to do it.
Yeah. So pull on later, see you tomorrow morning, and we're going to talk about it, and then the conversation's very different when they can, it's not a concept anymore. It's something you can, like, tangible. And so it's the same thing happened with the rest of the company. I did all hands, maybe it's the Monday after that exec offsite. I remember the exact timeline, but it's something thereabouts. And all hands, everybody came in expecting the normal all hands stuff. It's like, everybody strap in, everything I'm about to tell you is under a super duper NDA. And here's what we're working on for the next 9 months. A mistake that I make, and I think other founders sometimes make, is you expect everybody to kind of go along. They're like, this is because you're like, this is obviously amazing. You're like, this technology, for example, is obviously amazing. I can't imagine. And actually, a lot of folks were pretty at first. I mean, first of all, they've been with the company for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, whatever years. They've seen us do at that point kind of at least one, if not two, major feeling like pivots. And like, here we go again. I think you have to think about your credibility with your team, right? And it took actually some time for the whole company to really be like, are we really doing the right thing? Like I could sense that, like people are like really kind of skeptical. And what changed basically everybody's mind is we started, we were allowed to kind of expand the secrecy, veil of secrecy to a few clients. Yeah. And we brought them in and we did like kind of live like demos or them using the product in front of the whole company. And anybody was able to kind of sign in and watch real lawyers have their minds totally blown, as opposed to me just saying it's gonna be amazing, or Pablo, so my co-founder, or Laura, my co-founder, saying it's amazing. Watching these folks just have their minds absolutely blown is like, I think it was a really major moment for us at the company.
Fall of 2021. News of this GPT-3 software from a little company called a little hybrid nonprofit for-profit called OpenAI comes out, and you couldn't really get access to it. It was hard to get access to GPT. This is like September of 2021. But I had heard about how they had developed this complicated organizational structure where they were half nonprofit, half for-profit. And ironically, I thought at the time, I was like, well, people have already written about GPT-3 and the language models and stuff like that, but I don't think people have written about this interesting new hybrid model. And so I went to hybrid organizational structure. And so I went to the Times Magazine and I said, hey, I want to write a piece about OpenAI. I'm not so much about the language models, but about how they're structuring this organization. And they were like, oh, that sounds interesting. That turned out to be a very important part of OpenAI's history that exploded, 2 years later in the whole conflict with Sam Altman leaving and being fired and coming back. But it meant that I got access to GPT-3 as I was reporting that story. And so there was a night in early October where I was like, well, I better try this thing out while I'm, getting ready to talk to these people about the organizational structure. And I sat down with it and spent 3 hours, and it was probably the most important transformative moment in my history with technology in my life. I mean, certainly up there with seeing HyperCard and seeing the web. Those are the three. And I just had no idea how insane it was that you could really have a not even really a conversation, but you could write a paragraph or instructions and it would continue the paragraph and write mini essays, and it seemed to know things about the world. But just the mastery of language was so overwhelming. And I just suddenly, again, I was like, oh, all the things I've always wanted, if you could attach this to your reading history and to everything else, you could finally build the thing that I've always wanted. And so I ended up going back to the Times Magazine and saying, I'm going to mention the organizational structure stuff, but I'm just going to write about what does it mean that computers have mastered language? What is going to be now possible? Forget AGI, forget superintelligence, which is what everybody was talking about. I was just being able to chat in conversation with a piece of software unlocks all these new things that were not possible before. And we're going to spend the next 10 years just thinking about what that means and what we can build with that. So I wrote this 10,000 word piece, which came out in April. So this is 6 months before ChatGPT came out. And it was hugely controversial. One of the most controversial things I've ever written in my life. I enjoyed 0 minutes of the wake of that piece coming out, because everybody was like, oh, Stephen Johnson has fallen for the hype, and he doesn't realize that this is just autocomplete on steroids, and it's a stochastic parrot, and wow, he's so naive. And it was just, I'm just very conflict averse anyway, so I'm like, that part of my career is the thing that I enjoy the least, so it was very unpleasant. But I think other folks read that piece and said, oh, there's something interesting here, so I'm glad I wrote it. And at that point, Google, there were a group of folks inside of Google who had spun up a new division called Google Labs. And there had been a Google Labs in the past, and this was a kind of new iteration of it. And there were two things going on at Google Labs that were relevant to this. One was, it was an idea of, it was going to be a space inside of Google where you could do product-focused experiments with emerging technologies. And so it wasn't just abstract research, and it wasn't one of the existing product categories. And you could do these experiments that could be messier and that could explore the possibilities of new technologies. But they were supposed to have, as part of their mission, we're going to try and make something useful that people would want to actually integrate in their lives. And they had this idea of co-creation, that they wanted to, if they were going to make a music-related tool, they'd bring a musician in on day one, and then he would be, or she would be there in the room making the product with them. And Clay Bavor, who was running Labs at that point, and Josh Woodward, who now runs Labs, had read Where Good Ideas Come From. Where Good Ideas Come From had influenced some of the design of Labs. And they read my piece, and they were reading my Substack about tools for thought, and they read this piece in the Times Magazine. And apparently, I don't know, Josh came into Clay one day and was like, what if we could get Steven to come and like be the like first co-creator, and because he's obsessed with these tools for thought. And so I got a cold email from Clay, who was like, longtime reader, first time caller, and can I talk to you? And I ended up going and doing this meeting with him on using their Project Starline technology, which is this like hologram that is amazing. They've now since made public, but you sit in front of like a screen and a without glasses on, and a 3D like fully realistic person like is sitting in front of you. So I went into that meeting, and like it was the only meeting in my life where the first words out of my mouth were "Holy shit!" Like this hologram appears, and so we have this incredible conversation. And at the end of it, Clay is like, "Look, man, you could just advise us, and come in every couple of months and give us an inspirational speech and feedback. But like, we think we can actually build this thing you've been chasing like your entire adult life with these language models. And we have a small team here that is kind of already starting to think about it. Why don't you just come part-time, like 50% of your time, and come and just be in the room with us and help us build it?" And I was like, I would like to do that. That sounds great. And so honestly, I thought at the time that it would we'd build a prototype, because there was a team kind of out. There was like 3 engineers allocated to it and a designer. But I thought, Google probably has a million of these things, and we'll build some prototypes. I'll meet some interesting people. It'll be a great adventure, and that'll be it. But I think because from the very beginning, we started in July of 2022, and we. So again, before the ChatGPT moment. And so we were trying to build, the first thing we were trying to do is take the language model and ground it in documents, and not just have an open-ended chat, but say, this is the source of truth. And the very first experiment we did, it was the project that preceded it was called Talk to a Small Corpus. I could take a small corpus of material and talk to it. There was a brilliant engineer named Adam Bignell who had started that project. And so Adam and I, we loaded up my book Wonderland into this thing, and I had like in a collab, like there was no UI. I was like totally, so wonky. I had to learn all these things I didn't know how to do. But I could ask like, what does Johnson say about the history of like musical instruments? And I would get this very rudimentary little answer, but it was like grounded in the original book. And that was like late August of 2022. And so then we kind of spun up a little prototype, and Sundar saw it I think in November or something like that, and was like, whoa, my mind is whirring with the possibilities. And so we were able to like all through it, it was a bit like HyperCard for a while, in the sense that like the underlying model just wasn't good enough to do the things we really wanted to do. But we just started building the UI, which was as much of it as the model. Like, what does the surface look like? How do you manage potentially, hundreds of documents that you might want on a given project? And how do you get past just a chat interface and all the things that we've been doing recently? We're like, the underlying AI will catch up to our ambitions here. Let's just like charge ahead and make a slightly broken product, and it will get smarter and smarter. And so that's kind of what we did. And it really wasn't until we switched over to Gemini Pro 1.5 in May and June. So now what you basically can do with NotebookLM is you create a new notebook, which is in a sense kind of like a commonplace book for a given project. And you can upload, up to 50 documents. It can be up to 25 million words of information in a single notebook, which is just so mind-blowing to me. And it can be, PDFs, and they can have images, it's becoming increasingly multimodal. And once you've done that, effectively, it's not training the model. And so we're not, taking your information and putting it in the model that other people could use it. It's all secure and private. But effectively what it is you get a kind of personalized AI that is an expert in all the things that matter to you, in your reading history and all these things. So I've taken that 8,000 quotation collection that I've been curating since 1999.
Wow.
And I have it in a single notebook, all those quotes. And I've been slowly adding all of my books into that notebook. So I have about 6 of the books in there. And so I just haven't had time to fully build it out. But basically that notebook is going to soon enough have all the important ideas that I've ever read and all the important things that I've ever written, that I've ever published.
At a high level, I think there were sort of like 2 paths. One is that your base layer is very, very simple. And this is, again, a debate we have seen in computer systems for decades, like literally decades. And I'll give you examples as well, right? So one idea is that your base layer is very simple. And the other is that your base layer might be more complex. I think this is where the Muneeb school of thought and the Vitalik school of thought like diverges, right? And it's sort of like pretty interesting fork, right? And over there, I think what Vitalik looked at pretty much the same opportunity. Like even when we looked at the Ethereum white paper, it was like it's motivated by exact same things. Like it was pretty much exactly the same thing. The difference was in the implementation style, right? Vitalik was saying we're going to start a different blockchain, and what we're going to do is we're going to make it sort of like fully programmable and have a lot of complexity in the base layer. And my gut reaction was, hey, you might want to do the opposite, right? And here's the reason why. Because if you look at the evolution of a lot of these systems, it's time and time again, you do the complex base layer, it works really well in the short term, and it works really badly in the long term. And in the long term, the systems that have sort of like survived and have been category winners were the ones with very, very sort of like simple base layer. And the examples would be, one is the internet itself. Like back in 90s, there were multiple different designs. TCP/IP is the most simple format that, hey, here's the base protocol, very, very simple. You can build more complexity on top of it. There were much more complex network designs. They were trying to do, a lot of complex logic at the routing layer and keeping state there and whatnot. Whereas TCP/IP is sort of like, hey, simple base layer. We're just going to move the packets. Other things can be built on top. A lot of people might not remember this, but back in the day, even Unix was a controversial idea because most of the intellectual capital was working on this system called Multinix from MIT, which is a more complex base system. And then Unix was these people in New Jersey, and they're like, hey, who knows what they're doing? And they came up with, no, we're going to build like a very, very simple sort of like primitives, and you can build more complex things on top. And now nobody has ever heard of Multinix, right?
And your point about durability and time is a really important one, right? So I think the TCP or IP protocol were developed, in the mid 70s, give or take, and you didn't get the web, sort of HTTP and websites until the early 90s. So there's sort of a 20-year period of, development on top of a core set of protocols that ended up coming in a very layered form. And that architecture has proved, correct, I think, in the internet and very durable. And I guess to take that as an analog, we're still in the figuring it out phase when it comes to blockchains, and which will ultimately be the dominant architecture because Ethereum did launch. A lot of stuff has been built on it. It's been very expressive and very interesting. Bitcoin has always stayed steady, stable, simple. But now in the last few years, it's been possible to keep building new layers on top of Bitcoin the way you're doing. And, thanks to a few other things that I think have sort of opened up that opportunity space over time.
We sat down and thought through what is the end goal of decentralization, as in what purpose does it serve for the user? Because everything should be delivering value. And I think sometimes technologists get a bit hung up on technology for technology's sake, which is, well, there's this beautiful ideal I have of a purely peer-to-peer system that is completely horizontal and every node communicates with every other node. But yeah, it might be complex to use, but it's so like beautiful in the abstract. But then when it meets the real world, you have problems scaling. Users have problems using it. And it's hard to get the real world to bend to fit this perfect idea of a system. Instead, we tried to start from human-centered design, which is what do people want? Why are they dissatisfied with social? What is going to make them want an open alternative? Because we think it's good that you have openness and control, but sometimes people would rather just have convenience with all of its attendant ills than like have to fuss with their keys, And so we thought about the key things we want out of decentralization are choice and customizability, because when developers can build, you have all these options, and you want the ability to exit if somebody does something that you don't like. So you might be happy using a service in a totally centralized way up until someday they do something that you really don't like and you want to migrate. But that threshold for you migrating has to be really, really high right now, because you have to get a new identity. You have to rebuild your social graph. You have to port all your data over, or maybe you can't port it over. So it's just starting over from scratch. But if you can port things more easily and you have this right to leave and vote with your feet, then you can move around. And so it's more like choosing jurisdictions. So the way that we describe the sort of ethos of App Proto and the way we've built Bluesky is a federated republic. So you have these different services that can run on this network, and there is like some centralized governance to it, like centralized moderation to it, but you can choose other jurisdictions, both within the app by stacking other moderation services on it, or outside of the app, because you can move around, choose another service provider. Now, how easy is this to do over time? How many are there? These are questions about an evolving ecosystem, but structurally, that's the philosophy of it.
I think that is so cool. For folks who might be listening who are familiar with Bluesky, they might not be familiar with App Proto. So maybe it'd be helpful to just explain what App Proto is briefly.
Sure, yeah. App Proto is short for the App Protocol, which is can think of it as a toolbox for building social applications. So it's a social protocol. It lets you build Bluesky. You can build other sorts of apps on it by defining your own schemas. And it's sort of a bundle of things that all work together. So there's an identity system. There's a way that we do data to make it portable. There's a way that we, do moderation and curation. That's sort of not, if you do things differently, it's not like you're completely off protocol. You might be protocol compatible with a few pieces of it rather than the whole thing. And so you don't have to adopt all the pieces of it. But if you want to build an app that works a lot like Bluesky, all the tools in the toolbox are there, like Lego building blocks that you can take apart and put together to build a new kind of social app.
I'd love to zoom in a little bit on the sort of genesis of Bluesky. Like, how did it come to be? This was incubated inside of Twitter. It didn't end up inside of Twitter. Let's just talk about how it came to be at the beginning.
Sure. So I never actually worked for Twitter. I've never actually worked for a company larger, like that. Bluesky is now the largest company I've ever worked for. And we're 22 people. So that sort of gives you a sense of my career history. But what I was doing at the time was I was a decentralized social researcher. And I heard about Bluesky when Jack announced it on Twitter. And so Jack and Twitter had come up with this independently. They had been inspired by Mike Masnick, a tech reporter who had written a paper called Protocols, Not Platforms. And it was essentially advocating for a protocol-based approach to social networks to resolve some of the issues around, the debate around speech, around moderation, around algorithms and curation. And Jack got inspired by this and said, Twitter should have originally been a protocol. Let's make it a protocol now. And so he tweeted that we're going to fund this team to build a protocol, and then Twitter's going to run on it. This was late 2019. At the time, I had been working on researching and tinkering and building decentralized social protocols for a few years. In 2018, I prototyped something that is roughly shaped like the App Protocol. It's the sort of foundation of the data structure I was playing around with back then. But I just realized I needed market adoption and product market fit. So I started building something similar to Facebook events as a Facebook events alternative to get whole social clusters to migrate at once, because it's really about bringing your community. We're not individuals on social, we're communities. And so I was trying to get that off the ground. And then when I heard that announcement, I had been talking to a co-founder about joining forces. He was also building an events app. And we were, just saying, maybe we should raise money, maybe we should take this somewhere. When I heard that, I was like, oh no, I've got to get involved. This is the complete summation of like everything I wanted to do, which was just build the protocol and take it to a company willing to adopt it. And then, it's like I saw it as a fast track towards mainstream adoption. So I got involved as an external researcher. I met Parag at a speech at the Internet Archive I gave because I was talking about this overview of decentralized social protocols, and we chatted afterwards. And then he put me in this Matrix chat room. So Matrix is another decentralized protocol that does Discord style chats. And Bluesky for about a year and a half was just this Matrix chat room with a dozen people. And then we expanded it to about 60 people, and we self-organized a bit and, took on some research projects. I led an ecosystem review where I surveyed everyone in the space and compared point by point all these different social protocols that had been trying to do something along the spectrum of federated to decentralized. But during 2020, as you call it, the pandemic hit. And so not much progress happened on Bluesky during that time, nor on my events app. And so basically, I just kept reading and researching and doing this ecosystem review. And so we published that sometime in 2021. And then Twitter said, okay, we're actually going to do Bluesky now. Let's have a call for proposals. So anyone who has an idea for how we're going to do Bluesky, write up a detailed proposal, and then we'll pick proposals and interview folks. And at that point, I think some people had given up on Twitter actually doing this. But, late 2019 announcement of the project, 2021, they started to get moving on stuff. And I helped several other people write proposals as well, actually, because I just wanted this to happen. I was like, look, this is a moment for decentralized social. If Twitter never does this, I don't think any other big companies are going to try it. Right. This is the moment, right? So I tried to get other people to, submit proposals too. I don't know how many proposals they had, like several dozen. And then they started interviewing folks. So they interviewed me, they interviewed other people, eventually chose me to lead the project. And in my proposal, I had, drawn out how Bluesky was going to work. We've actually built something just very similar to what I originally proposed. And I went ahead and said, I think we need independence, because if we do this within Twitter, I had seen how slow that they were moving and how Jack was our biggest champion. And there were other folks at the org, like Parag was warm to this as well. But, Jack was the person who really had the vision of like, this needs to happen. And I wasn't sure, like they committed to this project over 5 years, but I wasn't sure, what would happen in 5 years. It's a long time in social.
Yep.
Jack could leave, something could happen. So I decided, we really need independence. So then after I got nominated lead, I was still outside the org, and they said, well, you could join Twitter and, be a subsidiary, like much like Birdwash was a team that was independent within Twitter, and they built out community notes, like pretty autonomously. So we could have gone that route. I thought about it, talked to some Birdwatch folks, but then I thought, we really need neutrality for this, so that I can go talk to other organizations, not just be a Twitter, subsidiary. And I really need to have the ability to move fast, do things my own way, hire my own people, like really without all this process, and be able to just go for it in a way that's independent of all of old Twitter's like baggage and process. So I spent 6 months negotiating for independence, finally got that.
Wow.
And then we were essentially contractors commissioned to build out the app protocol for Twitter. So we were still working closely with Twitter. I had weekly calls. I talked to all sorts of people in the org. But then very quickly, things did change because Jack left, Parag took over, Elon made a bid to buy Twitter. There was a long period where we didn't know if he was going to buy Twitter or not, but it kind of froze things up within Twitter. And then when he finally did, we just saw the news like everyone else, because being outside of Twitter, we didn't even get internal bulletins. We just watched the news. And essentially, the week before Elon actually bought Twitter, we just had the sense that something was going to happen. The deal was probably going to go through. And we were like, we've got to put out an app, or like at least let people know that this is still going to keep going, that it's going to be a thing. So we just threw up a landing page and said, hey, we're going to build an app on the app protocol. It's called Bluesky, same name as the project. Check it out if you want. And we just got, hundreds of thousands of people signing up immediately. So we're like, all right, we got to launch this app. And so that was the origin of the Bluesky app, essentially. We built the app protocol first. We were, all in on this plan to be the protocol that Twitter used and work through the institutional chain of, Twitter sign-offs. And then everything just got thrown up in the air.
I run an early stage venture fund called ante. And as you said, we invest in technology that either directly or indirectly gives people more control over things like privacy, data, assets, algorithms, the information they consume, and so forth. I think that we really see that as being an important component of the tools that underlie a healthy and functioning democracy. That ultimately, that is the type of technology that will help to advance democratic values in the world and fundamentally helps to address or counterbalance opposing forms of technology that often, manifest as digital authoritarianism, which is a kind of big loaded word that we can talk about, or phrase that we can talk about more, as well as its kind of corporate counterpart, which, you might describe as surveillance capitalism in the words of Shoshana Zuboff, or something along those lines. And, I think when I step back and think about like, what is the purpose of technology more generally, I like to think that the best technology is the tech that makes us more human and makes us more like humans and less like robots. And I think sometimes we actually forget that. I think there's lots of tech that helps us morph ourselves into robots. I'm seeing that more and more these days with like the quantified life as it's manifesting in lots of different corners of our lives. And so I think fundamentally the strategy is a little bit about how do humans interact with technology in a kind of big macro sense, and then also how does that interact with political systems and how we want to set up society?
It's interesting to hear your description just now because there's let's call it more of a defensive framing, which is we could be headed towards a world that is where technology has more of a digital authoritarian or surveillance capitalist approach. And that's something we need to protect against. And then there's something more of a proactive posture, which is about more like humans and less like robots. I really like that because I, in general, feel like it's important to have positive visions, not just negative visions. But just curious how you think about those two ways of looking at it.
I also feel that way. This is something I've thought about a lot. You know, I used to sort of describe this whole domain of technology as, you know, anti-authoritarian tech, which I never really liked. I will say I liked that it was very specific and addressed something very, you know, kind of concrete. But you know, anti-authoritarian tech does not really roll off the tongue for anyone, and it was negative, you know. And I think I agree with you. Like I wanted to think about what is the positive, proactive vision for the future that encapsulates some of the same elements, but is not about, you know, purely reacting to the bad or being in a defensive stance. Because, you know, that I think that's both less inspiring and also more constraining. I kept coming back to I think these concepts around freedom and around agency and around autonomy and potentially around rights. And to me, I think agency sort of felt like the kind of the most purest form of that. That frankly also isn't loaded with the challenges that come with talking about a concept that has a legal framework attached to it, aka rights, right? And so it was important to me to think about like what is the essence and can we distill that outside of, you know, various extrinsic factors that often define these terms.
If you're to think about human agency as expressed through technology and digital tools and experiences, what are the first things that come to mind? What does agency mean for an individual? Why should I care? Why should I be thinking about it?
I think that often it comes down to consent and context, right? I'm not a privacy at all costs type of person. I actually think privacy is the sort of thing that is a societal value that you must think of in the context of its trade-offs with, you know, public safety or with the values of potentially sharing information for the public good. You know, there's lots of trade-offs there, but I think, you know, it sort of comes down to whether or not you have a choice about sharing that information and whether you have the kind of full context to have meaningful consent. And in every instance, some people may choose to share more information or not, or to believe some of the information that they're consuming or choose to reject it. When I think of agency, I think of consent, choice, control, and context, like having the full picture. Now, you know, that is a very consumer oriented way of thinking about technology. I think that's the one that often like clicks or resonates for people initially the most. How that's actually expressed in our investing strategy is often a little bit different. It's a little bit less direct, you know, so forth. But I think that's sort of what, you know, agency can usually be boiled down to. And I think so much of our digital world has been built around kind of deliberately not giving choice because, in fact, oftentimes humans don't like making choices. We kind of like being told what to watch. It's why a news feed or why a continuous scroll is so effective. It's why nudging or, you know, opting out versus opting in are like such effective digital strategies to coerce certain behavior. And I get that. I get that, you know, why that's evolved the way it has. But I think fundamentally, like choice has not often been built into the DNA of digital systems or kind of tech ecosystems.
The big idea that we're trying to tackle is how do we automate organizations? So if you think about, you know, the most important things that humans have ever built, organizations are a piece of it, right? We're not all atoms just floating around. Like, we work together, and we're able to do bigger things. We're able to make our lives better, our families' lives better, hopefully all of humanity's lives better. And we haven't really seen a huge innovation when it comes to that in a while, really since like the 1800s. And the real innovation at that point in time was the joint stock company.
Yep.
So everything kind of flows from that. It was an amazing American invention, actually in New York. We figured that out here. We said, hey, we can get folks together. We can give them a little bit of breathing room, limited liability, and they can go off and try to make a profit. They can try to start a business. And that transformed capitalism, it transformed America, and ultimately transformed the world.
And not just capitalism, but like coordination and cooperation in a way.
Completely.
People think about capitalism mostly from the competitive angle, but I think the point you're making is that by creating an organizational structure of a company, we've figured out a new way to work together and have our incentives aligned together and cooperate in a different way.
Completely. And it started with capitalism, but then we're like, oh, this is a pretty good way to handle the organization of capital and labor in part. Maybe we'll have not-for-profits. Maybe we'll have blended versions.
Right.
Maybe we'll have something like a mix of different organizations that's a limited liability company that enables funds. And really, we haven't seen anything huge happen in this new era that we're a part of, which is the internet era. And I think we're kind of proceeding from the early innings to the kind of middle innings.
Yep.
And every time there's a big revolution in technology, there tends to be a different revolution when it comes to organizational structure. And so we've been fascinated at Tribute with this idea of a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization. And the idea is that we can figure out new ways for people that are primarily online or spending more and more time online to work together. So they're not sitting around just like chatting with one another, banding together maybe to effectuate some sort of social change or rip somebody down. They're able to actually do productive stuff online, whether they're in New York, whether they're in the United States, whether they're in another country. I just think long term, if you close your eyes, that's just the way more and more activity is going to happen. Doesn't mean that we don't have traditional corporations and all these other traditional forms of organizations, but in the future, I think more and more people will do stuff online in these organizations. So how do we get there? Well, we have to automate a whole bunch of stuff under the hood for that to happen. And we've been collectively just kind of obsessed with this idea for quite some time. Like, how do we get rid of the guts of these organizations using any tool available for automation that we can? So we spent a lot of time looking at blockchain technology. We've been increasingly spending time looking at all the great AI tools that are now available. And maybe there's something new like on the horizon. If there is, that we're going to explore that too. So that's the hunch that we're kind of working towards.
It's interesting. You describe this as helping autonomous or helping automate organizations. Autonomous is the middle word in DAO. I think most people, if they've ever heard of the word DAO, they think of it as sort of like a crypto thing with like people holding crypto tokens. The autonomous part hasn't really been so much a part of it, I don't think, although there's a lot of automation in the middle of like smart contracts and so on. But do you think it's really about automation, or do you think it's really about some new way of coordinating, humans?
I think it's both. Right. Yeah. I think, the more you can reduce the cost of coordination, just the different shape of the organization.
Right.
So like as we've gotten information technology advancements, the costs of doing things have gone down. Sometimes they've gone up, right? They can get a lot more messages. There's some costs to that. But on balance, they're trending down. It's easier to do more and more stuff. And so we've been able to see like bigger and bigger organizations form from that. And I think what it looks like in the long run is just really, really thin layers of technology that are enabling lots and lots of different people to do things. So maybe that starts with a couple hundred people, and then it scales up to several thousand, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then millions. And if you look at some of the biggest networks that we have, it's billions of people at this point. So I think ultimately, at some point in the future, that's what we'll see one or more of.
So the story of the first 20 years of the internet is about people coordinating in new ways at really, really large scale, and the various companies, protocols, platforms in the middle of the internet have kind of facilitated that. but that's not really autonomous in the sense that you're thinking about what might be possible in the next phase of the internet.
Yeah. Well, I think there's always somebody in charge of those networks at this point in time, right?
Yep.
They're organized in a corporation. There's a group of people that are kind of setting the rules, dictating things. They're really stewarding those networks, and it's worked great. But lots of folks that are big stakeholders, users, participants of those networks, they've grumbled like, hey, where's my voice? And so I think what we'll see emerge is more ownership. And that's where another piece of the autonomy. It's not just automating things. It's that you have the right, you're an autonomous actor in these organizations. And I think that's great. I think you see open source organizations across large networks where people have a voice, they have a say, they can make it better. Different stakeholders from different parts of the planet can participate in that. I think net, could be a very healthy way to organize more and more important global functions. Maybe that's democratically. We played around with that. Maybe that's more algorithmically.
Mm-hmm.
That could be good. That can be bad. There's good and bad things about that. But I think it's kind of that area that we really want to play around in and figure out really well. Maybe there's also non-human folks that are participating, like agents.
There already are.
Yeah.
Probably.
So maybe they have a voice at some point. Who knows? It's going to be fun.
I think the agents probably
They're
certainly listening.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're
there it
speaking just yet, but I think they probably are. All right. I think that sets the way I hear what you're saying is we've already had the internet helping us coordinate in new ways for quite a long time, but we're probably on the precipice of something new that's possible, that's at the intersection of the brand new technologies, crypto technologies, AI technologies, and your thing is like, how do we shape that together? That's been your thing.
Yep.